Hi, all. This is the PS podcast, and I'm your host, Chaitanya. Today, as my guest, I have Professor Amaresh Chakrabarti, who is a senior professor and the current chairman at the Center of Product Design and Manufacturing at IISc Bangalore. His interests are in synthesis, creativity, sustainability, and informatics. He has published over 16 books and over 300 peer reviewed articles. Honestly, my introduction of him is not doing him any favors. If anybody wants to know more about him, they can just head on over to Google Scholar and it will be testimonies to the sheer amount of work Professor Amaresh has contributed to the world of design. I found my conversation with him to be particularly interesting because the guests of this podcast take some time to adjust to the mannerisms and the structures of this system. Professor Amaresh seemed very calm and confident in what he was talking about, and thus we did not need to beat around the bush of surface level conversation. We talked about the definition of design and the many facets of it. We talked about the misinformation, disinformation, and the lack of information in the world of design. I had some questions regarding conservation versus innovation, which he answered pretty well. We also brushed over the unstable yet improvable marriage of capitalism to sustainability. The advent of complete automation was also brought up, and the potential mass unemployment that can happen because of it. Lastly, we talk about Industrial Revolution 4.0 and a little about its precursors. All in all, I enjoyed this conversation a lot and I hope you do too. So without much further ado, Professor Amresh. So, as we are running sort of short of time, we'll just directly get to the questions. So, I'll start off with a very big question. Yesterday, we were talking about design and the way you explain design in the design research methodology that you were talking about it. I felt that the approach that you have taken towards the definition of design, it's a scientific approach, right? In a way, you said that there is this situation and one wants a better situation, and design catalyzes it. And from where I come from NID, they get appalled when you tell them that design can be explained scientifically. All in all, they think there is an abstraction, there is a emotional concept to it that cannot be grasped by a scientific approach. So, what would you say about that? Can design be defined purely scientifically with a scientific approach?
If the answer to this question is no, then anything goes as design. What would you distinguish design from non-design with? So you definitely need a definition of design, and whether it's emotional or otherwise, it doesn't matter. But there has to be a position that one has to take as to what design is, because otherwise, it doesn't distinguish the domain from everything else. And the approach that I have taken is actually an established approach. This is probably the most widely used definition of design, which is changing existing situations to preferred ones. Now, it can be also existing emotional situations to preferred emotional situations, existing aesthetic situations to preferred emotional situations, existing usability situations to preferred usability situations. So, the definition is such that it actually doesn't constrain you, it actually makes you free to work in the areas of interest that you have so that you can take that focus within the broad definition that this provides.
So I was reading your paper on design for emotions. So one confusion that I had was, let's say we have designed something for a certain demographic. Now we know that the subjective choices, and you have talked about the subject's background because each subject might differ in their background and thus their interpretation of the stimulus might. Now the demographic changes with geography. The demographic and the interpretation of the demographic also changes with time. So that is why my initial question that can a scientific approach keep up with the changing definitions and the changing interpretations of the subjects? Let's say we design something for a homosexual couple. Now that might be ridiculous in 1950s or 1930s, but in today's world it might be accepted a lot or quite so. So is the definition the best we can keep up with, or is it something that you can encompass for eternity?
Well, I think it would be easier to discuss if you give a specific example.
Oh, that was my specific example. Let's for a example
Okay,
of product.
so let's take a specific example. Now, what are you going to do with the homosexuals?
Let's say we design a tourist luxury package specifically designed for a homosexual couple.
Absolutely
And
fine.
as I said, it is absolutely obnoxious and ridiculous in times of 1930s and 20s. And now the demographic has changed, and now the designer can actually work on it. And they never know when it might change again. So, is this something that can be taken into account in design, and how so?
Yes, the answer is absolutely yes, because the definition doesn't position you with respect to type. It says whatever the existing is, we want to make it better in terms of the preferred. So whatever happened in 1930s was the existing situation at that time, and the preferred would be with respect to that as the benchmark. Whatever it is in 1990s or 2010s or 2020s, the preferred is going to be with respect to that. So the understanding of the existing and the preferred are always relative with respect to where that existing is. So clearly, this point can be solved now, and at that point of time, it was not a relevant problem because the situation was not existing.
So, would you say that it is a continuous research and execution?
Even the same problem, if you revisit that 20 years down the line, it becomes a different existing problem. So your existing, because the existing situation has changed, which is why we can have continuous improvement in many of the areas. The way in which we used to design things with which we would listen to music, in the 1980s and 70s, were more with the existing situation at that point of time, which is that there was no concept of internet. There was no concept of cloud where you store the music. Today, with all the I related things, that has become possible.
iCloud. Yeah, understandable. So, India has, at least in my opinion, always had design thinking in itself, at least on an indigenous level. But officially, do you think India is now adopting the mentality of design thinking? Is there a push from the government, or with various design colleges propping up, do you think it will reinforce a sort of a design thinking? And does India require it right now?
Yeah, I don't see a very concerted effort to adopt design thinking. Although there are pockets in which design thinking is popular, there are people, Gujarat government, for example, I have interacted extensively with Gujarat Technological University, some of the IAS officers in Gujarat government. They are very keen to adopt design thinking for solving even their policy problems, but I haven't seen that everywhere. Okay, right now I am in discussion with Karnataka government about training large number of people in design thinking. There is no, I don't see a uniformity, unlike, let's say, Industry 4.0, where every ministry right now is absolutely gung ho to adopt that. I haven't seen that. There's a little bit, maybe design thinking was maybe partly promoted by industry of DIPP, basically, Department of Industrial Promotion and Policy,
Okay.
because they were, I think, the ministerial body for NID. So when NID was championing design policy, then at that time this got pushed. But I don't see any concerted effort. So that's the first part. Second part is, do we need it? Yes, absolutely we do. We need to expose people to design thinking in multiple areas. And as you said, design within the broad definition of that, something like what I have spoken about, can be various. You, for example, are working in visual aspects, some people are working in animation, others are working in strong technological aspects or user interface and so on. So there are different kinds of design that can fit, but I think the basic message of the identify, ideate, consolidate, and select that goes through as a cycle is something that cuts across these domains, and that message has to go to people both in educational spheres and also is the social spheres of life.
So, what is the factor that you think is limiting it?
Yeah, I think there are two factors. One is that there is a very fragmented community called design community in the country. And to a large extent, if you look at the evolution of design as a discipline in the world and in India, there are sort of four views of design or designer. One is the craft designer. The other is the industrial designer. The other is the industrial design engineer. And the other is the innovator entrepreneur. And if you look at the first two varieties, craft designer and industrial designer, by and large, their influence in the development of designs have been limited to the areas that I would call more human centric or formal areas and not so much functional areas. And as a result, broadly, the technological aspects of designing and the formal aspects of designing have remained more or less sort of disconnected with one another, assuming that there will be two groups of people that would come and they will kind of do it in some order, one order or the other. Maybe functional will be first done and then aesthetic designer will come and put a screen around that, or the other way around, they will define the overall product and the technical parts will be done by others. And I think time has come that we need to look for designers that are systems integrators. Those who are not necessarily good at both, and it's hard to be good in both, but they are at least appreciative and sufficiently knowledgeable about both that they can at least know where further, deeper insight with more specialized knowledge is necessary. And if you look at India at this point of time, I would say that primarily NID and to a large extent IDC is championing the first two views, the craft designer and the industrial designer with aesthetic leaning as what is design. And if you look at IISc, IIT Madras and IIT Kanpur and several other IITs, IIT probably Delhi as well, you see a more innovator, entrepreneur and industrial design engineer as the view. And I think we must allow for all of these definitions to coexist and thrive and complement and integrate so that they actually work together to create a very diverse yet very appreciative ecosystem for design. And this is something that has to happen. We cannot afford to, in a country as large as India with the diversity that it has and with the past and the future, afford to get locked into one definition or the other of design.
That's a very interesting thing that you said, that there needs to be free trade routes between the aesthetic leaning and the engineer leaning. I think that's right, spot on. Talking about industrial design, my question is that in the earlier times, most policies, let's say after independence, most policies could, on a wide scale for the masses, could be supervised and the authority could have been of the government. For example, they would suggest that eat namak with iodine. And they would make sure that it happens and the product has that. Now that a global capitalist economy is taking over, which is inevitable, do you think that private companies hold a bigger responsibility to inculcate sustainable design? And do you think they would go for it? And should the government introduce regulatory reforms? Because I think the power is, if not completely shifting, leaning and inclining more towards capitalistic industries, which is not a bad thing, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. So, 3 points. Point number one is that the word sustainability is still confusing, ambiguous, and also it's not easy to assess sustainability. There are various, what I would say, guidelines. Yeah? Use biodegradable, use natural energy, renewable energy, consume less, and so on. But it is not easy to connect them to the what I would call global sustainability. One way to look at global sustainability is that if there is the world's temperature changes by 4 degrees Celsius, then it will be disastrous because by that time we will get so much of snow becoming water that will capture so much of landmass that will be too little landmass to be available, and people will start civil wars and so on in order to survive, and as a result it will be catastrophic and the whole world order has to recalibrate in a very dramatic manner that we cannot envisage easily at this point of time, leading to, for example, wiping up of civilizations like it happened in Assyrian civilization at the time of called in Iraq 600 to 800 BC and things like that. So what we need to do is we need to first of all actually spend a lot of effort into understanding and relating sustainability to guidelines that a designer or a society can follow, like eat iodine in namak and so on. I don't think that clarity is still there. Number two, assuming that it is there, who is responsible for ensuring that it is followed? We have to ensure that there are rules, and these rules don't just come. It's a two-way process. Either the public administration sees the need for the rules and they implement the rules, like saying from now on only CNG and no more diesel and whatever other fossil fuel vehicles, or the community becomes so strong, they say that we need this, we can't breathe this air, that they force the government or the service provider or manufacturer to ensure that certain norms are followed. And it is always going to be a combination. It's not a totalitarian society, it's a democratic society. So we need to work both ways. We need to educate people or train people in understanding this. But as I'm seeing, because I do research in sustainability, that there are major gaps in research into sustainability itself, which makes it weaker for people to also force some of these points through. So 3 points. Point number 1, sustainability research has to be strengthened. Number 2, public sentiment and understanding awareness, not folk science, but real science has to be strengthened. And number 3, the government's hand has to be strengthened with knowledge. One example that I want to take is the following. People will normally say plastic is bad, paper is good. Okay? If you do a life cycle assessment using any standard technique like United Nations Environmental Program, promulgated eco indicator or any other technique, you will see that plastic actually requires far less energy to produce, it requires far less chemicals to produce, it requires far less water to produce, and the material is so non-biodegradable that for a long time it can be utilized without the moths and the microbes eating it away. As a result, it's a phenomenal applications in medicine, in packaging, where the long-term packaging has to be mentioned in a very cheap and inexpensive manner. Paper is pathetic with respect to this. It cuts down forests, it pollutes water sources, and so on. But it is biodegradable. And that to only certain kinds of papers, because the moment you put one layer of plastic or wax or something, it's no longer biodegradable. Okay. So these are the kind of uninformed guidelines that people follow today has to be stopped. And at the same time, one has to ensure that there are better metrics with which these can be assessed and taken a decision on.
I read an article somewhere that when plastic was starting to be mass manufactured, they considered it a godly material because of the properties you just outlined right now. But what you talked about brings me to a question that I was going to ask you later, but it might be suitable for now. The problems of climate change and global warming, can we address them through conservation or will it only happen through innovation? My question being, okay, using metal straws might be good and not using plastic straws might be good according to the conventional guidelines that are there. But if the masses adopt metal straws, every one of them, the manufacturing cost and the pollutants that come out of that would be much more than what is being done for the plastics. Also, changing to wooden spoons and wooden forks, I don't think is a realistic approach. So, do you think reduction of pollution will come from conservation, as it is being endorsed on social media, and it's trendy right now? And tackling of global warming, will it come from conservation, or will at the end science have to come into it? There will be batteries that are much better, and thus people will have to force themselves to switch to to batteries instead of fossil fuels, and instead of lowering deforestation, they'll come up with algae plants that can produce much more oxygen than a forest can. So, what do you think would be the key factor?
Okay, so if you look at again problem as a whole, okay, the population is increasing, the resources are constant, more or less, a little bit more. If you think about food production, things like green revolution and so on has certainly increased production, but there is a limit to how much it can go to. So clearly resources are limited, population is increasing, and aspirations are increasing. Everybody wants to have a car, a flat, maybe 2 cars, maybe 2 flats, maybe 3 cars, maybe 3 flats, and so on. And in the short term, that's good because that increases development, as in there are more people to dig metals and dig earth and find, put these things together and so on. But if you look at the long run, if people are increasing and their aspirations are increasing and the resources are limited, that resource is not going to satisfy their aspirations. And there will be more and more people that are dissatisfied, or larger tracts of the society that will be dissatisfied, leading to all kinds of infights and bickerings and so on. So, question is, how is the human race going to survive given this is the challenge? broadly speaking, one major direction is that people need to be educated. In particular, the women need to be educated, because women are the ones that are actually training the next generation, and they are also the ones through whom production of new people happen. And it is in their interest that there are not too many people produced, because they also, have a much harder time surviving. And we need to strengthen their hands so that the rest of the society cannot force them to do it. And that will be the approach, rather than the sort of totalitarian approach that we had taken earlier to contain population. That's number one. And it has been shown over and over again in history that when people are more educated, the number of children they have is less. For two reasons. One, that education makes them economically stronger, and they don't see the reason why they have to produce many more with a very high rate of mortality. And second is that they also know the value of utilizing all that money to make their next generation stronger. Second point is about aspirations. Okay, we designers are the creator of aspirations. Okay, we designed something called advertisement, and advertisement is an innovation that led to a continuous expansion of aspirations. Okay, unlike any of the economic theories had projected, because it is very easy to sell somebody else's lifestyle to you, and with television and now with internet, it is also easy to expose aspirations to people, no matter what economic strata they are. Okay, that makes it very hard to check aspirations. I think we need to have champions and role models of a different kind of aspiration, where we still want to have exciting and interesting life, but with a dematerialized form. And that is what we want.
I read somewhere that a regular person right now is eating better food, more nutritious food than a king might in the earlier times. He's wearing better clothes. The weave is much more finer than what a king would wear. He's of course driving a much technologically advanced vehicle. But a person never compares himself to his ancestors. They will always compare themselves to their acquaintances and colleagues. That again brings me to another question. I'm very happy how organically this is happening. So, how can India and the world as a whole tackle the conflict of consumerism and reliable product design? What I mean to ask here is, companies can easily design a phone that can last for 5 to 10 years. A bulb can easily be designed that can last longer. But in a capitalistic world, in a consumerist world, companies don't survive like that. They have to have a constant supply of purchasers where purchases can be made. And of course, as you mentioned, advertising is like steroids for the whole process. Companies, at least I can see that companies are not aiming for a very long, reliable product that inhibits the customer to buy again and again. So, how do we tackle this conflict? Because consumerism and capitalism needs to grow, otherwise it collapses. On the other hand, we need to start, utilizing better, as you said.
Yeah. Now, I will of course give my view, but it's not necessarily right. I cannot prove it. Okay. My view is that increasingly we'll need to work towards product service system design. So, as I said, the issue is with materials. As long as aspirations are satisfied using less materials and less energy, it will be sustainable. As long as those materials and energy that we still utilize go back to their sources and continue to remain in the cycle, it will be sustainable. So if you look at those 2 points and they say, can we redesign our aspirations as a combination of the pressure from the community and the pressure from the government in terms of public rules and laws and guidelines? For example, think of this situation. Somebody is designing a mobile phone, and then after the mobile phone's life is discarded, after the mobile phone is sold, it is the responsibility of the consumer to take care of it. As opposed to that this company designs a mobile phone, and then this mobile phone at the end of its life, wherever, the consumer can go back and get it replaced by that company. And it doesn't matter whether it's new or old, as long as it functions as new and old and it looks like it is new. Functions as new and looks like it is new. Now, what the company can do now, it is in their best interest. When I am responsible only up to manufacture and then selling, I don't care about service, I don't care about retirement. Whereas, if I have to take it back, I can design such that it is easy to take back, not only but also that I can take every individual part from inside and reuse in my new ones. So it might be that at the end of the day, the replacement cost for the consumer becomes much less than the original cost, because all that is getting replaced is the cover, or a little bit more than that, and all the material goes back. So you have now created a cycle, and you have also made it much less expensive for the consumer.
So, have you seen case studies where this actually reduces the sourcing prices of the sourcing materials for the company? Because, as far as I know, slave labor or cheap labor and cheap extraction from third world countries, that becomes very cheap for the companies. So, have you seen cases where this has worked?
This question of cheap labor is actually a win-win. The reason that the companies are coming there wherever there is cheaper labor is because there is a cost advantage of doing that. The reason why the cheap labor is interested in that is that his other options are limited. So it's a win-win condition.
No. My question meant that extraction of new materials in cases where that is cheaper than reuse of the materials. I've seen third world countries ka communities grow also because of companies bringing their sweatshops in their countries. Yeah, I agree with that. But in places where extraction of materials is much cheaper than reusing the materials.
Extraction of materials will never be cheaper than reusing the materials unless somebody is trying to use somebody else's material to reuse. Okay, let me explain that. See, one of our PhD students, Harivardhani, worked on, dealing with e-waste, electronic waste. Okay, if I have an electronic waste, say your laptop, okay, it is, life is over, it has to be now it's thrown away. Normally, what would happen is that the sweatshops, they will break it open, find the metals, like there is a little bit of gold there. Primarily, they will go for gold, a little bit for copper and so on. Some heavy metals are there, and that's it. They are not going to reuse anything else. Because who is going to reuse it? Only that company can reuse that, because their configuration is such that reuse is possible there. Now, if I am responsible for collecting this back and making sure it doesn't go into the landfills, I will look this as a product opportunity for me. I will redesign the product such that it will be easiest to recycle those materials, reuse those materials, so on. So it is not the same product. Yeah. It will lead to creation of completely different kinds of products where, for example, IBM came up with a chemical that you spray and the entire PCB gets disassembled into its individual parts. They will not use it right now because why should they do it? But if you have forced them to have the entire life cycle, they have no choice but to do that. They will redesign the parts. They will maybe put a PCB here that is twice as long as this, because they know they can take it out and put it in the next one. All of that will start happening.
I've never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
So the R&D goes one step further to ensure the extraction again.
Exactly. They will make sure that happens, because there is an expression in materials, it's called energy content. So when I take a fresh material and give some shape to it, there's a certain amount of energy I've spent on that. Correct. That's a good marker for how much is the environmental impact. Correct. Okay, because energy is the biggest source of pollution. So if the farther I am from where I'm digging the material to eventually create that object, the further I am from that, the more energy I have to put it to bring it back to that state. The closer I am so reuse therefore is the best option, because I hardly have to put any energy back. So the energy content of the material goes down dramatically if I'm closer to that. So it's a very good scientific reason why it is true.
Very interesting. Okay, the second last question, I think, which is a little tangent to our conversation. What are your thoughts on complete automation of the industry? And what do you think of the growing demographic of unemployed people, if there is any? I understand if you are automating, the automation itself requires a supervisor, and we can train people for that. But I have personally observed masses coming from villages, they feel very alienated because of the changing requirements of the jobs. So have you given any thought on this, and what are your opinions?
Okay, I think this is a very relevant question, especially with Industry 4.0 being spoken about everywhere. Now, for you and your audience, maybe let me just spend 1 or 2 minutes on industrial revolutions. Now, the major changes in the way in which industrial production has happened in the past have often been described in terms of 4 sort of landmarks. One is when human and animal power was replaced by machine power. And the first time that happened in a substantial way is when an efficient steam engine was developed. Steam engine was not invented by James Watt. It was invented by most commonly somebody called Newcomen, who already had steam engines at least 50 years before James Watt. James Watt made it efficient enough that large companies can employ that to create, not so much create systems, but to run the tools with which systems will be created. So as a motive power. And that led to the first industrial revolution. That was a major precursor, major driver. The second industrial revolution was to make sure that energy is available in a ubiquitous manner. If you have a steam engine, you have to place the engine and only you get power there. But if you have electricity, you can then throw the electricity around anywhere, and that gives tremendous distributedness to the way in which you can use electricity power. And that, so it got replaced by electrical machines, right? And also, people realize that if you organize people, channel their work in a more structured way towards production, you can do so much more than you could do in an arbitrary manner. So it is organized production. That's the second concept that came back. Third industrial revolution happened when computer was introduced in production. So you could suddenly, for example, control some of the activities and so on. And what is being touted as the fourth industrial revolution is where connectivity among the various entities within the production ecosystem brought to bear. And by doing that, one can now do many more decision making and actuation at a systemic level than at an individual level. So those are the fourth industrial revolution. If you look at those revolutions, they are all automation. So in other words, the society has increasingly become automated, both in terms of providing energy and channeling the collective power of people, and also in the decision space. Has the number of jobs gone down?
I wonder. But not yet.
And the reason why it has not gone down is because the market has expanded. What was available earlier, that only 3 people could afford, now millions of people could afford. So one is able to provide greater good for a much larger group of people. The question is, where do we draw the line? And it's very hard to say where to draw the line. What we have to ensure is that we understand what the implications of each revolution is, and we organize our training and our research and our practice around that to make sure that best advantage is taken for this. I'll give you one example. Okay, I have a person who has been working in my workshop, our department's workshop, for the last, say, 30, 40 years. Okay, one of the best craftsmen when it comes to using a legacy lathe machine, right? Brilliant piece of work. I can get that work done by a CNC lathe today, as long as it's programmed right. So this skill has shifted from how well he controls his hand to how well he writes his program. We have to ensure that the new age workers are trained in the appropriate technology.
So that was my question, that whether it will be easy enough. So to train a villager about handling, serving burgers is much easier than training him how to code, wouldn't you say? And do you think it will be an organic transition?
The world will always move to new levels of equilibrium, no matter whether we do anything or not. The question is, are those equilibriums is what we want? Yeah. So, if I may go back, say, at one point, people would have definitely said, we are replacing all these horses with cars, and wouldn't that lead to mass job loss? Because right now, caring for the horses and carrying materials on their head, all of that. So, all I can say is that empirical evidence shows that people always find ways to survive around. We need to ensure that we do it in a more structured way. So, one of the things we are doing in our department right now is to create 2 different smart factories. One is a human factory. Typically in a micro or medium enterprise, you have 3 or 4 machines and then maybe 3 or 4 people, and each of them can do everything in any of those machines. And any order comes, they cast it in terms of those capability of those machines, and they do it. That's a completely manual factory. Think of another one where there are a bunch of robots that are putting everything together in very high throughput. The human factory's advantage is that it's highly flexible, and the usual automated factories is high throughput. there are no factories at the moment that is both highly flexible and also high throughput. Okay. So what we are trying to see is, if we connect these people, does it make their what are called key performance indicators, productivity, safety, sustainability, in this case resource consumption, and so on, do they go up or not? And do they go up substantially? So the question that we are asking is, can we apply an industry 4.0 to any factory rather than only go for a complete automation kind of view? But ultimately, it is the competition that's going to decide which one stays and which one doesn't, and whether this is able to give that at the cost or not. If it turns out that there is a sector in which automation is what is providing the industrial sector the competitive advantage, then if you don't adopt it, you simply get wiped out. So this question doesn't arise. So what we are trying to see is that, and we need to do that as a country, is that what are the techniques and tools that you can provide to each group of industry so that they can go up the value chain and become more competitive. Because ultimately, if they are not surviving, question of job doesn't exist.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Think of it like that. Okay, so now we're ending with our timing. So I just have some 4-5 rapid fire questions.
Yeah.
You can just answer them in one word or a sentence. So these questions are mainly aimed at young people and what they can get out of it. So first, if you could go back 20 years, what is the one thing that you might do differently? Yourself, your own life.
So 20 years would be when I am just finishing my PhD. I would probably take more design courses, something that I didn't have opportunity to do.
What is, in your opinion, the biggest problem that India is facing up today? Or one of the key problems that might not be addressed in a way that it should?
It's a couple between, we have a lot of people,
Yeah, that's.
but which can be good or bad. We have a lot of people, and a lot of people talk about demographic dividend, that next 20 years we are going to be the youngest country and so on. All of that is true, and that dividend will become a nightmare if these people are not properly trained and educated. That's the biggest problem. Training a large number of people and keeping them motivated and employable. That's the biggest problem. It's coupled because one way to do it is to reduce population. Then you have to train less people. But at the same time, you have to also improve your quality of education so that the quality of education is better. So all of these people are better employed and more than better employed, maybe better able to create their own employments. But in order to do that, you have to treat your teachers well. And in our country, teachers are not treated well.
Has it been like they are treated well, then now they're not treated well? Is it like a
I think
oscillation?
for a long time, teachers were taken for granted, and as a result, people moved out of the teaching profession. Okay, so to explain it slightly better, if my colleagues, at Germany and Japan, for example, it doesn't matter to them whether they went for a job as in industry or they went for teaching at a point in their career, except for the last 5 years of their career, where people go to CEO level and there's a very non-linear increase in salary. Let's just look at salary. Okay, our salary at my level, for example, compared to my salary would have been if I were in an industry that I would have been in a position at this point of time, would be something like 1:5. It's almost 1:1 in Germany and Japan. And we need to make sure that the choice becomes irrelevant so that best of teachers have a chance of coming to teaching.
Realistically, do you think India is capable of doing that? Does it have the resources?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Because if you look at the amount of percentage of the GDP that India spends on education, they are abysmally lower than the countries that it aspires to compete. China. China spends about 5 times more than India on education. And it will be a minuscule percentage of that or a significant percentage of that, whichever the case is, but it's still within that percentage, to pay the teachers better. It doesn't have to be 1:1, but it should be close that people don't feel that they are having a much more poorer quality of life. And that should be true not just for people who are professors like me, but also people who are school teachers. So that they can go to school teaching and love doing that because they don't have to worry about whether their children will be able to go to good schools, whether they can be treated in good hospitals and so on. And they will be totally then motivated. At least they have a chance to be totally motivated to doing what they want rather than worrying about how to make the ends meet. So I think paying and respecting teachers will be a major benchmark of how well teaching will happen. And as a result, the entire country will either benefit or suffer.
Even I believe that a lot of problems can be tackled through a good execution of education from ground level till the final level. Final question. What is one message or advice you would give to students who might be listening to this?
A lot of people talk about follow your passion, right? I say work hard. If you work hard, you will find passion in anything. Okay, because all these subjects, no matter which subject, there are exciting stuff in there. That's why people spend their lives developing them. But unless you dig deep, you don't see it. Ultimately, great people do stuff that are great, not because they were exceptionally brilliant, okay, or different kinds of genes. They were just exceptionally motivated. And where does that exceptional motivation come from? It comes from putting sustained work over a long period of time, where they begin to see the beauty in everything that they do. And Lincoln was once challenged, I'm told, by one of the senators. He was coming to give his inaugural address, and somebody said, do you realize that you are a shoemaker's son? And my shoes are made by your dad. And everybody laughed, thinking this would, stun Lincoln, because they were obviously very aristocratic society. Lincoln said, I absolutely remember that, sir. And I'm sure there are many people in this room whose shoes are made by my father, because he was one of the finest shoemakers in the country. And he did his work with passion. And if there is any problem with shoes, I can fix that for you, because I can also make shoes. However, I've never heard any complaint about the shoes of my father, because he is one of the greatest of shoemakers in the country. So, what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't matter what you do, work hard so that you find passion in doing that. And once you find passion, you don't have to be told to work hard, because you'll do it because it's fun working hard. So fun and working hard are actually two sides of the same coin.
It is like the legendary story of Vivekanand giving the speech about the number 0. Unless you are knowledgeable enough about something, you can't see beauty in that. Sir, it has been wonderful talking to you up until now. I just wanted to run a news by you that I read today only. Ohio has passed a bill where students can now give answers to scientific questions based on their religious faiths. And their
Based on their?
religious faiths. And they have to be marked with that. They cannot be said that they're incorrect. So if a paper is asking how old is the earth, they can say 6,000 years old. So,
Okay.
I don't know. I just thought I should let you know. I don't know what is happening on the other side of the world.
Yeah, I think it took a very long time to develop what is called scientific temper. And things that take a long time to develop doesn't mean that it will take a long time to destroy them. We have to uphold scientific temper, because there are things for which there are better and more accurate answers, and not all answers are equally correct. And I think this is something as a scientist I must uphold. And I'll give one example. I'm told that at some point, it's only, at least in the European tradition of science, it was only in the mid, sort of 15th century, at the time of Descartes, René Descartes, that people had the clarity, Descartes and Galileo, that they had the clarity that the way in which you test something is by observation. So observation is the tool for testing. It's not your opinion against mine. Mm-hmm. And who shouts more strongly. Mm-hmm. And how many people supports that person. It's not democratic either. It is scientific, is about having a way of falsifying your statements. having an argument that if I see X, then my argument is incorrect. If I see Y, then it's correct. And that is scientific temper. It is not the science that has to be right. Today it may be one law, tomorrow it will be another law. But both the laws are the best possible answer to the question against the scientific observability and the observations that are around at that point of time. So in that sense, of course, science is also designed in the sense that you are improving the existing understanding to preferred understanding. But just to complete that discourse, there are ways in which to test whether the universe has been 6,000 years old or whether it has been 7 million years old, because we have observations. And therefore we must have that scientific temper held. Otherwise, we will quickly, sort of dwindle back to Middle Ages and beyond.
As I was saying, it was wonderful to have you, sir. And I really resonate with whatever you say. I hope we can do this again sometime at some place. And I would also like to thank Prasad, sir, for introducing me to your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.